I love it. I love it. You like the ching ching,
Ching ching.
the ching ching. We have to give it. We have to get a better name for that. But the ching ching. Hey guys, everybody, welcome back to Pencil to Pencil, your favorite pandemic podcast, brought to you every week at 8 p.m. EST by your good buds, Mike Manley and Jamar Nicholas. Well, hello. You know the universal greeting. Well, hello. Hope everybody's well. I know we missed last week. We were all set up to go, Mike Manley, and then I lost power.
Thor said, "Tonight I want silence."
Yeah, it was rough. I don't know anybody that's in the southeastern Pennsylvania area, the East Coast, knows that we've been having a million crazy lightning storms, and just Mike, we kind of live around the same area. Did you have the, what do they call it, sideways rain? Like it was crazy.
Yeah. I think what I saw the storm, because we're probably about 15 miles from each other.
Mm-hmm.
It just went a little bit north and east of me. But I got nailed. What was it, the week before? And then I was reading an article in the paper that we're having all of these super intense microburst thunderstorms.
Microbursts, yeah.
Yeah, and Philadelphia, because of its proximity to large bodies of water this time of year, but just in general, the ferocity of the storms has been increasing.
Yeah, and it's just, and the one thing that we had last week, it was 10 minutes.
Yeah,
it was probably 10 minutes, and everything went sideways.
They said we got certain parts, like up near you, got 6 to 10 inches of rain in that time.
Yeah. And it was this, if at the gym where they have the ropes, I'm not doing it, but the guy that does the rope thing, that's what the rain looked like going down the street sideways. And then it hailed, and then everything went boom, and that was kind of it.
And then the lady went by riding a bicycle, and the guy rowing the boat. Yeah,
showing my age. That's crazy.
And you were there.
And Uncle Joe, you were there. But we're back in living color. Thanks so much for being understanding. If this is your first time watching, this is a live in-person video sister component to Draw Magazine. And Draw Magazine, Mike, how long has Draw been in existence?
20 years now.
20 years. That my loving friend Mike Manley has been the editor-in-chief of Draw Magazine, published at Tomorrow's Publishing by our good buddy John Morrow over there. And there was some point in time where Mike and I started talking about, you know what, maybe we should do another format of the magazine, maybe kind of like punching it into a new generation of viewers and readers. And we've been doing this podcast for around 2 years now.
Really? That long?
Yeah, like we were doing the audio ones for a minute, and then we started doing the video.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Mike.
No, it just seems like that's kind of the way everybody is going. I mean, a lot of magazines have I think video versions of the magazine now. And I think for this it makes sense because we can take advantage of technology. We can talk to people live. We can do demos. There's so many more things that we can do in this format.
Yeah. And we've got to bring a whole new way of talking to our creative and artistic community. I think we're in a place now where people want to see it, Mike. The audio podcast had its place and it still is doing strong, but the video is so strong.
Well, what's better? Hear me talk about a drawing, or you talk about a drawing, or a guest talk about a drawing, or actually see the drawing?
Right. And you can't replicate that by going, okay, guys, Mike is turning the page and he's putting the pencil to. It's not the same, right? So, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Just let me give you guys some housekeeping before we get started. If you're new to the podcast, you have the chance to interact live with Mike, myself, and our guest, Bruce Zick. I can't see you, but if you activate in the chat, If you're watching on Facebook, in the reply or comments, and then on YouTube, there should be like a super chat or something like that. Type in there, get into a good flow of conversation, and if you bring any merit to the conversation, I'll put you on the screen. So before I clear all this, I wanted to also give a shout out to our good buddies at Graphicsly who make Clip Studio Paint. Yes, that Clip Studio Paint, the one almost everybody in comics uses at this point, Mike. It's really beating the brakes off of Photoshop, if I'm not mistaken.
I think for comic books, yeah. I mean, I know they're that, you know, it's a lot of people still do digital painting. Although now I guess some people are doing digital painting in the Clip Studio Paint. So I think it's always good to give Photoshop a run for their money.
Yeah, and it also, I don't know if anybody messes with it. I mean, it has a really robust 3D modeling suite. I haven't used it, but it's a thing. And also you can animate with it too. I don't know if anybody uses Clip Studio in that way, but I'd love to hear about it. So I want to introduce our guest who just disappeared, Mike. He just zapped out of the green room. So, you know, hopefully he'll be back. Maybe he had a glitch. But we have acclaimed illustrator, artist, designer, concept artist, comic book illustrator, Bruce Zick with us tonight. And there's a return to greatness, Mike Manley. I know a lot of people have been asking, yo, who's the next guest? Yo, who's the next guest? And, you know, I think we've got a Murderer's Row again kind of lining up. So, Mike, maybe you could talk a little bit about Bruce, and then I'll fill some time until he gets back.
Oh, so okay, so he's disappeared.
Yeah, he disappeared, but hopefully we'll get him back.
I was interested in having Bruce on the podcast because he does sort of similar to me in that he's done a lot of different things. He's done, you know, illustration, work for film, animation, really amazing, cool animation, background designs. And as we were talking before the podcast, I think that's going to be really typical today moving forward, is that you're going to have more than one job and you're going to work in more than one medium. And if you're working in comics, you're probably going to work in animation. And if you work in animation, you might do three different things. I don't think it's going to be like it used to be where you're Charlie Schultz and you just do one thing your whole career.
Yeah.
So I think it's good to see artists that work with cross disciplines and bring in a lot of, you know, you can take something from comics into animation, something from animation into comics. Somebody made a comment on one of my, I posted one of my fine art paintings on my Facebook, and somebody said, oh, you know, your comics look one way and your paintings look another way. As if they would assume that maybe because I do comics, right, that my paintings would look like what my comics are, which
Kirby hands.
Yeah, but they're very different things, and they require different techniques, different way of thinking. And so I think it's also good at going back and forth between something like doing a plein air painting of nature actually influences my background design or drawing or thinking in something like the Phantom, where I'm having to always draw these environments, jungles, things like that. You know, when you pay attention to the pattern of leaves or the way light falls through a scene, you can take that into another, you know, from observation into comics.
And, you know, we talked a little bit in the green room about just kind of like putting so many years into the craft, you start to amass a lot of stuff. Like one thing that is not of this generation is the idea of owning a morgue, right? That's old illustrator and cartoonist speaking. If you don't know what I'm talking about, a morgue is a file cabinet full of images or clipped magazine things like horses, buildings, you know,
or like yeah, right, or like let's say right, you would separate it into people, places, animal, things. But you like, if they did a thing in Time magazine on the Oval Office, snip, 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 you put that in there, because you wanted to have reference. And all the guys I knew who were older when I got in, that's the first thing you learn, like, oh, you got to have a morgue. You got to, it was like, what is that? Oh, you got to start having a reference file. And before Google, that's how you would have to go specifically to the library and ask. Now, if you were an illustrator or a comic guy and you lived in New York, you'd go to the New York Public Library. They have research people. So you could say, I want to see a picture of the Statue of Liberty being built, right?
Yeah.
Now, you could probably find that in the New York Public Library. But if I went to my little local library, they probably wouldn't. And I remember this specifically because it was an issue of Quasar that I drew that took place with the Statue of Liberty. And inside the head of the Statue of Liberty, I could not find any reference. I went to the library, went to a couple local libraries. I think I went to the Philadelphia Public Library. I could not find pictures of inside the crown. I could find plenty of pictures of outside the crown. And I think I found a blueprint. So I'd have to look at the picture of the outside and then look at the blueprint and try to extrude good enough for an issue of a Marvel comic. Of course, now if you Google inside head of the Statue of Liberty,
you get, if your safe search is off, you might get something else.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
I was going to say, or you could rent a VHS copy of Ghostbusters 2 and then get a interior.
Right, but you know what? Even if you used to do that, because I know I did that sometimes, and other people would do that. Back in the day when you had a VHS tape and you froze it, it was not always a sharp image. Or that something would be moving until you got to the point like, that's what I want, and then it's kind of
it's like Jacob's Ladder fuzzy.
Right. Yeah.
Mike, our good buddy Suzanne Maringo, says back in the day, Mike and the studio mates would do superhero poses for reference. That's an age-old thing in the studio, right? They would take pictures of the film camera and then drop off the rolls of film and get them back the next day at the photo mat, right? And then you go like, that's not exactly what I wanted. That's And when I worked with Al Williamson in his studio, he had right behind his desk, he had a room that he had built to put his projector in there. And in that room, he literally had thousands of photographs that he had taken since the 50s. Yeah.
So what he would do is he would lay out his stuff, and then he would shoot photo reference. And then between his drawing and his photo reference, he would get what he wanted. But he had pictures going back to the stuff he did with EC. So he had pictures of him and Frazetta and George Woodbridge and all the Flegel gang in that little room behind his desk,
Yeah. Wow. And now, it's a whole other world, and just kind of showed some of the lengths we would go through just to get the perfect image, to get the shot.
Well, now what you would do is you would take in the old days, you would take a picture of a car, right? And this is what all the strip guys would do. They would go out, they would get a car, and then they would shoot the angles they want. Then they would put it in the projector, project it down, draw it, and then ink it. Now, I just import it into Clip Studio and just draw over. So there's no projecting, right? Yeah. I can just skip that whole step.
Yeah. And, but now, there's SketchUp and all those other things, but you still have to have the idea in your head and the shot that you're trying to get. So let's stop gabbing and let's bring in Bruce. I'm really excited to have him. Guys, you're in for a treat. And I would encourage everybody to, drum up some good questions for Bruce, Mike, and myself. And let's get the party started. All right. So let's bring him in. You ready for this, Mike?
Oh, we just drew Bruce Zick.
Wow. How did you do that?
That's right.
Magic.
It's magic. Welcome to the podcast, Bruce. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, the transition graphics are something new that my apprentice came up with, and I think it just raises our level just a little bit more. So,
Well, I just have to warn everybody, I'm living on borrowed time here. I think my computer crashed and I got back on, but I could disappear at any moment. And so enjoy me while you can. This could be it.
okay, we're on borrowed time. All right.
Although I promised to try to reboot again, but who knows?
We'll figure. We'll make it work because I know how to run my mouth, so I think we'll be okay. So, Mike, why don't you get started with the first round of questions, and I'll check out the chat room.
Okay. So, Bruce, why don't you give us a little bit of your background on how did you go into animation first? Did you go into film first? Were you always interested in comics, and how they kind of related to each other in your process?
Oh, well, I really was a huge comic book nut as a kid. And I probably learned to draw because of comic books, because I just loved, DC Comics so much. Back in the days when Al Plastino and Wayne Boring were doing Superman comics in the 50s and Bob Kane was doing Batman, I just was enamored with the look of those poses. So I spent hours and hours in my room drawing hero poses, as well as I'd like to draw Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble and a few other characters. But I was just drawn to it visually, and I certainly loved movies immensely. I mean, movies like King Kong just drove me crazy, and then the Ray Harryhausen movies, and mostly Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. I think that was a seminal moment for me when the Cyclops appeared on the screen for the first time, and I've never been the same since. So that sort of prepared me to want to be an artist, I think.
And did you at a certain point as a teenager decide that that's what you wanted to do? Did you go to college for it, or?
Well, I think I like the idea of being in comics, but I was more serious about being in a multimedia arts program and just learning a lot of fundamentals, including theater and film, and seeing where it went. And then every now and then I would draw some sample comic book pages that were just god awful terrible, and then mail them to Marvel Comics. And then at one point in my mid-20s, a friend wrote a sample Silver Surfer 20-page story with Galactus, and I illustrated it, and we just thought we're going to send this to Marvel, and boom, we're going to get hired, and we're going to work for Marvel Comics. So I was certainly unrelenting in wanting to do that, but I was making a living working in the restaurant business as a cook, basically. And then one day, a friend of mine who was living in Los Angeles had seen an ad in the trade magazines for artists to work in animation. And of course, I loved animation. And when that first big fat Disney book came out, with the white hardcover and the cutout of Mickey Mouse on it, and I just poured through all those beautiful pencil drawings, but it didn't connect to me that would be something I would do. But a friend sent me this ad, and I thought, well, I'll send them a sample of my drawings, mail it to this animation studio, and they responded saying, well, we can't guarantee you a job, but if you want to come down and interview with us, we'll be happy to meet you and interview.
Well, that's pretty cool, because I'm sure you were pretty excited about that, right?
Yeah,
the fact that they wrote you back, right?
Yeah, I was living on food stamps and working in a delicatessen, so I was pretty happy with that. So I did go down, and this was Ruby Spears.
Okay.
In their very first, they'd had one season, I think, where they did the Puppy's Greatest Adventure uh, specials, which we've never forgotten. They're like one of the most influential animated shows in the history. And then they, the next year, they suddenly got 4 Saturday morning cartoon pickup series from, like, I forget if it was CBS or NBC or ABC, but they just suddenly exploded in production, and they needed artists badly. So I interviewed as a character designer, and got rejected, but they said, they need some warm bodies in the background department, so we can have you interview that head of that department, which I did. And he looked at my portfolio and he said, well, I could see that you can draw all sorts of way out stuff, which, I did Kirby-esque machinery and fantasy landscapes and stuff. But he said, I can't tell if you really know how to draw or not. So um, uh, I can't hire you. There's a long story. So you guys have to corral me in, otherwise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, did they give you a test and say, like,
They gave me a
draw?
test.
Yeah.
I said, give me a test. I'll go home. I'll draw it. I'll come back in a couple days and show it to you. And so I decided to do like a haunted house and a graveyard or something. And then I showed it to the head of the department, and he goes, well, okay, I tell you what, we'll try you for 2 weeks. So, and that at that point, I realized I did not know how to draw, which I did. I didn't really know how to draw. I knew nothing about perspective. I've actually on my, well, no, I can't find it right now because I rebooted, but I couldn't draw a chair, a table, a window, a door. And so much of it was just everyday mundane stuff. And every now and then you got to do a juicy fantasy, science fiction kind of thing. But mostly it was normal stuff you had to draw.
Yeah.
So it was just humiliating. And so it was just a long, hard slog.
So what did you do? What did you do? If so, you get the job, and you go, I don't know if I got the chops to do it. So how did you go about, like, training yourself in a short time?
Well, here's the amazing thing. As I say in all the interviews now, that's a really good question. I don't know why, but suddenly everybody's always complimenting the interviewer with
It's stalling, that's all.
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
So it was at a time when the animation industry was unionized, and their union system meant that you started as an apprentice and were trained by your supervisor. So in this short 2-week period, I went through this very intensive training, and then I just drew almost like 20 hours a day. I was just so desperate to hold on to this job. I just barely squeaked through. It was, if I showed you those drawings, you would never imagine in a million years that I would get hired to even sharpen a pencil for somebody. But they needed warm bodies. They were just so desperate to get these productions out that had quadrupled in their first season. It was timing, and then I got trained to learn how to draw in my first year there. It was unbelievable.
Hey Bruce, if I have a question real quick. So Bruce, I'm a big video game guy, and not that that matters anything, but I kind of think in terms of video games. Was there a point in your first year in the animation industry where you felt like you leveled up, like from struggling with drawing a chair or a door jamb to all of a sudden, okay, I think I got it, and you started to just like head off to the races? Do you remember a moment or
Well, I had many false moments of confidence. Yeah. I remember at one point I was drawing Mount Fuji, and I thought, wow, I think this is pretty good. I think I'm getting it. The thing that was so intimidating about it all was I was in a room with maybe 8 other journeyman artists doing layout, and they just walk in the door at 9. They punch in their clock, time clock, literally, and they sit down and they have a cup of coffee and they light a cigarette. Normal, everyday people, and then they just start drawing brilliantly, like it just flowed out of them. And for me, it was just such a struggle, and I kept being inspired, but also intimidated by all this talent around me.
Mm.
I just really wanted to make it work, and that moment of drawing Mount Fuji, I felt confident, but then the next thing I had to draw, dashed me back to the ground. And I actually think, and stop me at some point, please, before I kill, but I think at some point I caught a mistake in the storyboard that had been given to us. It was a technical error in the screen camera direction. And back then, if they had followed the storyboards and laid everything out and animated it and then found out there was a mistake about it, it would have been very costly. So I went to my supervisor and I said, well, the cameras go in here from left to right, but in the following scenes, everything is flipped or reversed like in a mirror image, and it doesn't, the continuity doesn't work. And he sort of looked at me, my boss, and he said, come with me. And we went to the head of this whole Ruby Spears, Ken Spears of Ruby and Spears. And he said, Bruce just noted this mistake here. And I think it has to be relayed. The storyboard has to be redone. And they looked at me and went, good job. and I think just because I was showing that I was learning the mechanics in a short time, I just think I just squeaked through. And for the first year, it was just all hands on deck, draw every minute I could, learn everything I can. It just was crazy.
Did you work with anybody of note? Anybody that people who are fans of animation might know?
No.
He said no.
Yeah.
These were just normal, everyday schmoes in
Yeah.
the studio. It's funny because when I was going down to interview, in my mind, I thought, okay, I'm going to Hollywood and Vine, or I'm going to be on the lot of Warner Brothers where all the film studios are, and the extras are walking around and stars are smoking cigarettes waiting for their next scene, and props are being moved around, just like you. I thought that's where I'm going.
Yeah.
I'm going to be surrounded by the most amazing, wild, crazy artists, and oh, it's just going to be unbelievable. And then when I got there and the taxi drove me to Ruby Spears, it was out in an industrial area of lots and warehouses. It was you could be anywhere in America on this street. And it was just such a letdown. And the artists were just everyday working class people, earning a paycheck, who were amazing.
Yeah.
But nobody would ever know any of them.
No.
Bruce, Mike, and I call those type of structures Joker hideouts. It's just
It's like the old abandoned warehouse at the end of town.
Yeah.
You go in and just attach a few electronic wires, and you're all ready. You can run your secret lab, no problem.
So, looking over your very storied career, Bruce, especially your IMDb reads like a laundry list of. Are you ready for this? Because I'm showing my age. My childhood. You drew my childhood, Bruce Zick.
You're not the first person that has said that. Many people revere these shows, and the fact that I worked on Rickety Rocket or Mighty Man and Yuck or Plastic Man or
Turbo Teen.
or Turbo
Teen.
Teen, yeah. And certainly Thundar the Barbarian, that was sort of like
Yeah.
a big deal. But yeah, you tend to forget that people are watching these shows and loving them because
Yeah.
from our point of view as artists, we look at the shows and we go, "Oh, this is so awful.
Right.
Oh, it's such a limited animation. This background that I worked on for 4 days, this beautiful long, let's see, long background. Um, it goes by in 1 second on the camera, and it was like 1/10 of the detail was painted into it in just slapped out with a big brush. And so you just thought these shows are terrible, and how embarrassing, and little knowing that people love them, and so you got to remember that it's all relative. So.
Well, I'm sure the guys that did the Fred Flintstone stuff back in the day felt that way because they had come from the 40s and the 50s doing full animation, great lush stuff on the Tom and Jerry stuff, and then they're doing limited animation, for the Flintstones, which we all look at very fondly, but to them, and it's funny, I've told this story before, but so I wanted to go into animation, and I found this phone number for Hanna-Barbera, which had a trainee program. This is around 1980, and I called out there, and some grouchy old guy gets on the phone and goes, "You don't want to work in animation, kid. It's a shit business." Yeah, exactly. So, did you find that to be true? Were there grouchy old men who were like, "Bah"?
Well, yeah. I mean, there was one classic grouchy old man. His name was Robert Givens, who may be known by some people. He worked for Warner Brothers in their heyday, and was part of what did they call the studio back then?
The Termite Terrace.
The Termite Terrace.
Yeah.
He was part of that group of Bob Clampett and Chuck Jones and Fritz Freeling, and his name is on a lot of the credits in those layout credits that roll. And by the time I met him at Ruby Spears, he was sort of like an animation layout checker. He just sort of got things, made sure everything was all correct, and then processed it to the next person. And he was 70 some 80 years old then, and he grumbled and cursed all the time. There's a bunch of shit. and when he would talk, and we would always ask him about the heydays of the Warner Brothers time. We were all alcoholics back then. Everybody had a bottle of booze in their drawer, and we didn't know what the hell we were doing. And so yeah, I did meet somebody like that.
Do you think, and maybe this is just a question to both of you and to maybe everybody, do you feel like everybody's time before you was the better time? Like there's always everybody always has hazy memories of something that happened before.
Yeah.
Well,
I think even now to some degree, I mean, this is sort of, I'm not going to really climb up on a soapbox here, but
go for it.
I still revere the Disney period of movies all the way up to maybe The Rescuers or something, and all the stuff I look at nowadays. I just go, okay, this is technically amazing, and I'm blown away at the talent. But from an artistic level, I'm an old curmudgeon myself now, going, but look at the art of animation then versus the computer art of animation now. But that's a whole divergent branch, or that's actually a rabbit hole I could go down.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if that answers your question, but
well, I think it's interesting now, especially that people have kind of taken things from the past and remixed them and repackaged them and put them back on the shelf. Kind of like, your history with working on the Mr. T cartoon, right? And now the Mike Tyson Mysteries was a show that came on, which almost has the same exact energy of Mr. T and some of the tropes from it. And the style is like a throwback, You know what I'm saying? So like, I wonder, do you connect to any of like old is new type of things that are happening nowadays, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's tons of retro stuff. I mean, I think I don't think there's much to go back to in the 70s, in 80s as far as like Saturday morning cartoon,
Mm-hmm.
like Mr. T or Hanna-Barbera. I mean, yeah, the retro Flintstones, Huckleberry Hound, Jetsons.
Yeah.
There's a style there that I do think is a legitimate style to mine, to find a way to bring it back in a fresh way. And certainly the earlier period of the earlier 60s with the UPA style of
Mm-hmm.
animation, the very graphic 60s kind of looking stuff is very cool. And there are tons of artists that get that.
Oh yeah,
And that are doing it now. I mean, even like Samurai Jack and
yeah.
you know there's a slew of people who are the Mary Blair style. There's slews of people who get that and um, bring it back in a fresh way. And and often, like if you were to like Pixar, for instance, if you were to pick up a art of the making of one of the Pixar movies and see the pre-production artwork done by a lot of their artists, guys
Mm-hmm.
like Jifwe Bode. I never know if I'm pronouncing that right, but they just go all out on pushing the style heavily in the beginning, and the movies all look the same. They
Mm-hmm.
never utilize any of this style except maybe like in the Incredibles movie. They sure did try to capture that retro 60s
Mm-hmm.
look and did a beautiful job on that. So there are certainly old styles to mine to recreate and present again in a fresh way. I mean, yeah, you could go back to any number of old sources and go, well, let's do that. It needs to be redone again.
Well, there's a lot of stuff that came out in the late '90s, early 2000s with like Gendy and those guys who were doing Samurai Jack, Power McCracken, Powerpuff Girls, that were directly referencing
Mm-hmm.
the
And
50s UPA style or Hanna-Barbera version of the UPA style
yeah,
that's never gone away. And it keeps coming back over and over and over. People keep going back. And I think one of the reasons they do it a lot now is because it's easier.
yeah,
It's like when Bruce Timm merged the deltoid into the bicep. It's just easier to draw the arm with those two shapes.
yeah,
The more angular you make it, the easier it is for the lesser talented artisans to
yeah,
draw that. If you've got to draw the deltoid and know exactly where the deltoid hooks into the tricep, and and foreshortening and all that, like the Fleischer cartoons, that
mhm,
Superman has real anatomy,
Yeah.
right? And it's very beautiful in the way that's, but nobody has the time to do that on
yeah,
a TV budget,
right, sure.
you know?
But yeah, there's totally. I mean, Ren and Stimpy, SpongeBob. They're
Yeah.
all kind of getting it. There's a groove there. There's a beauty to all that stuff. You know, the Bruce Timm work. I was on Tiny Toon Adventures in the first couple of years, and Bruce was just a storyboard artist, and and we just thought he was the most talented storyboard artist we'd ever seen. And
Mm-hmm.
and for fun, he would just do these beautiful drawings, almost like Wally Wood inspired zany Mad Magazine drawings, and we were just agog at it, and it just made total sense that he finally got to shine and do what he did, and I'm sure he would. I mean, even if you look at his illustrations, he's referencing Jim Steranko and Jack Kirby and giving it his own twist, but he really understands what makes those work on a certain level and has reinvented it in his own unique way, which I really appreciate.
So you went in thinking to try to do characters, and you ended up doing layout. And then you sort of stuck with layout for a while. I mean, that's kind
Yeah,
of
I
where
was,
you.
I was pigeonholed as a background artist primarily, and then I would do layout and work with characters and layout. But I always wanted to do characters, which is why I always wanted to still do comics. So I never gave up pitching my comic book samples. And I remember one year I went to San Diego Con, and Dark Horse was just getting established. I think they had just done their first Alien book or Aliens, and they just were becoming a breakaway hit independent comic publisher. And I showed them my stuff, and they were just so open. They were just like, well, we're all new, and we're all taking a chance. We're investing in young talent, and so they gave me my first job uh, to do a series for Dark Horse Presents. And so is that my dog barking in your, or is your dog barking too, Jamon?
Yeah, my dog just started flipping out, but
My dogs are barking.
yeah, I think they hear each other. That's crazy.
I can only hope my daughter will hear him barking and pull him away. But uh, so where were we?
Well, we were talking about layout, and were there any
Oh yeah.
were there any tricks that you learned early on that helped you jump in your progress? Like, did you go over and look at, like, oh, I see how that guy or how that gal did that. That's something that I could, because when you're working with a bunch of people, you can kind of feed off of each other, or
Yeah. Well, I think what I just needed to do is I just needed to draw for a couple of years nonstop to get good. And here's my agent actually, and
Oh,
she handles all my business dealings.
hello.
And, am I getting paid for this? No. No, I'm not. No.
This interview was over.
This is my daughter Isabella. This is Mike and Jamar.
Hi, nice to meet you. So, did your father draw your childhood too?
Yeah.
A little bit. Right?
A little bit. A little bit. So after you left Rudy Spears, you kind of did you, and animation was really booming. That's the other thing too in the 70s, kind of like it's doing now, because everybody had all the demand for artists. Like in the 90s, there was a big demand because of the Lion King made that money, and then everybody's like, oh, they started throwing money at it. Everybody wanted to get into animation. Everyone wanted to do 2D animation. Did you feel the transition from 2D to 3D? Did you feel that in what you were doing?
You're talking about the beginning of Pixar?
Or just how, like, we've gone from, in the last 20 years, 2D is really now TV, and everything in the movies is kind of 3D. Yeah. So did you see that transition coming? Did you try to position yourself? Did you?
No, I just sort of, I think, made a name for myself as a pencil background artist, and that was my specialty, really. I didn't do color, and I wasn't really ever hired to do characters. I was hired to be the key background designer for productions, and that's when I started working for my first Disney movies, and back then it was only Disney, so I was really lucky to have gotten my foot in the Disney door through a miracle. And then when I saw what Pixar was starting to do, fortunately, they all still needed traditional pencil artists to do all the pre-production conceptual art, or visual development, as they call it. So I didn't have to like look down the road in a crystal ball and go, oh, I better jump on the 3D or even the color train. I just thought I can keep doing what I'm doing as a pencil artist and not really need to make a transition.
Bruce, let me ask you a question. Did you get caught up in that kind of Disney flush that they did when all of a sudden they weren't really going to do traditional anymore? Did
Would you repeat that?
that kind of flush out that Disney did when they decided they weren't going to do traditional animation anymore and everything was going to start moving over to 3D and computer
Mhm.
assisted? Was there a point where you, or maybe even people that you were kind of rolling with, were looking for work all of a sudden? Like, did that hammer drop on you?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if that was let's see, there was already DreamWorks at that point
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and Blue Sky.
So
So
you're able to move around a little bit
yeah,
more.
I think people like myself, we were agile freelancers. I was never a staff person at Disney.
Yeah.
I always freelanced, and so I always had to be on my feet, juggling things and never knowing where my next work was coming from, and not putting all my eggs in one basket.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to segue from Disney to work for Pixar freelance, and then one day I got a call from Jeffrey Katzenberg. I was living up here in Portland, and he said, "Bruce, I'm creating a new studio with Steve Spielberg. Can you come down here and do designs for us?" And so uh, I was still, able to keep doing what I did,
Mm-hmm.
and was only really wanting to do that. I just love. I don't know how you guys feel. I just love the pencil, and
Mm-hmm.
and I've been reluctantly pulled kicking and screaming into digital. And now I really love digital, and I don't do the kind of pencil lush pencil illustration I used to do, but uh, I just love that traditional form of creating artwork.
Yeah, there's something about drawing with a pencil on a piece of paper that's just so warm and personal, and it has to do with your relationship to your tools and your I don't know. I guess it was probably like a musician, when you're playing a certain kind of instrument. If you're playing a Stradivarius, as opposed to something else. Um,
Synthesizer.
yeah, yeah. But I was sort of also interested to go like, well, how would when you would go into you worked on Iron Giant, you worked on a lot of different things. Would you just go in for? Would you move to that place? Would you do
No,
it freelance? Would you?
yeah.
Is that how you did it?
Yeah, I always worked freelance. I moved out of Los Angeles in 1990 and moved back to outside of Portland, and so I always worked freelance. And depending on the production, I would get maybe flown down for meetings,
Mm-hmm.
but then I would do everything at home here and work through email and telephone, and that was before we had the Skype even. But I knew that technology was starting to happen, and I knew the studios had their own version of video conferencing going on, and I was dying for that technology to get to the point where it would reinvigorate the freelancers' ability to communicate and have
Mm-hmm.
relationships through video. But it took a long time for studios to go from an in-house video conferencing system to long distance relationships with video. I think Pixar was just really paranoid about putting anything out across the internet that was proprietary and top secret production related.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it, but I was always, I mean, I took a big hit not being at the studios and available to just drive in and be there. It was definitely a sacrifice to be long distance freelancing, but um, and that's why being in both animation and comic books sort of help balance things out. Like there would be slow times in animation, and then I could jump back into comics and start working on some books and things. And then
Mm-hmm.
uh, between the two, it kind of kept things moving along in a semi-secure sort of workflow.
Bruce, I was going to ask you about that. So one thing that I'm always interested in, because like yourself, and I have a ton of friends in animation and stop motion and all of that, is I always ask the questions about when is there the period in a job where your gut starts to hurt and you start worrying about the next gig, because that has to be just kind of a switch in you
Yeah.
where it's like start lining something else up. So like can you talk about that, and maybe
Well,
is it
actually, yeah, that's a really good question, Jamar. Thank you.
He's having that. You're getting that feeling right now, right?
It is a good question, I have to say. Yeah, well, as a freelancer, I imagine you all relate to this because I assume you're both freelancers, but you never stop thinking about where the next job is coming from, and I often work two jobs at the same time just because I'm so insecure. I mean, I dreaded getting an important phone call while I was in the middle of another project
right?
and then not being able to say no. Like, if I was working for Pixar, but DreamWorks wanted me on something, it's like, oh my God, I can't say no. I can't say no. But
Right.
then ultimately, you would pay a price if you try to juggle too much. It really burns you out, and
Yeah.
ultimately, you can't do two full-time jobs successfully. Although maybe you can for a while and make it work. But I for sure, um, if I thought I knew when the end of the project was coming, like they often would say, well, at some point, well, there's probably another month or two left on this. We just want to let you know. And then you go into like, uh, full scramble and like, you start calling and emailing and you're just like, oh, what else is out there? But you also are always sort of keeping your eye on what else is happening
Yeah.
and keeping track of your friends and people who see if somebody is on a new production. So, you never can just relax because you don't want that downtime where, oh my God, there's absolutely nothing going on and I am not working.
Well,
Yeah.
as a follow up to that, Bruce, I always wonder: is it better, like from a perspective of an animator in your like in house when you're freelancing, or say you land a film, right? Okay, we're doing Lion King now. That's going to take X amount of months to
Mhm.
complete. Or when you're doing a series like earlier in your career, would say you're doing Mr. T for 4 seasons or
Mhm.
however long that ran. Is there a comfort in that? Like, okay, well, at least we got picked up again. I know I'm okay. I can eat for another like
Yeah,
9 months.
right. Well, there certainly was back in the earlier days because um, things were a little bit more like the old Disney model in the
Yeah.
beginning with Pixar and DreamWorks and Blue Sky, where they all wanted to engage you very early on when there was just a script
Mm-hmm.
and have you just go into um, development and just experimentation for a while because the old Disney movies would sometimes spend a year or two just exploring.
Mm-hmm.
They had a first draft of a script, but they had no storyboards, they had no animators hired or anything. They just wanted to explore the range of possibilities because Disney wanted each movie to be unique, unlike any previous Disney movie. So that means they were going to search for a style. And maybe they would hire 4 or 5 or 6 completely different kinds of artists and just let them roam and see what they come up with. And then, like for Pinocchio, they chose Gustav Tengren as a main influence, or for Sleeping Beauty, they chose Ivan Earl as the primary designer. Um, and so, but until then, or like Tyrus Wong was chosen as the stylist for Bambi.
Right.
But up until they made that decision, these artists were just free to experiment with very little guidance until the production began. So I would have, like, when I would get the call and I would start, there would be that really juicy beginning stage of, oh, I can totally zone in on this. I know I've got months and months of work, and I can do nothing but be creative and not have a worry in the world
Mhm.
and just be free. And so they don't do that anymore. And ironically, as the studios became more and more successful, they shortened that time uh, in relation to their success. As they got more money, they paid people for less time,
Mhm.
and nowadays it's more like, hey, we want you to work on a project. Okay, now do this shot here, and we need this one there, and you've got like 3 months, and we need all this stuff from you, and we just want you to get it out, and then boom, you're done.
Mhm.
So you never relax in that kind of environment. Although um, more recently, in the last 3 years, I've come in. Here's my dog,
Yo, what's up, killer?
and he's hungry.
That's right.
Oh.
One second.
Yeah, yeah. I'll do an ID while Bruce is tending to his pooch. You're watching the Pencil podcast, hosted by myself, Jamar Nicholas, and my best bud, Mike Manley. Um, if you're just joining in, we're talking with acclaimed illustrator and designer Bruce Zick. Join in on the conversation. Type in a question or two. Bruce, I did have a couple of things in the chat that I wanted to get to. There were a couple of questions for you. And one is from one of our old pencilers, Myra. Myra says, "Hi guys, super excited to see Bruce Zick here. You hear that, Bruce? They're waiting for you. Bruce, you worked on Disney's 1997 Hercules. Could you please share your experience with that? It's my all-time favorite Disney film, Happy Face. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit."
I'm sorry, I can't. I'm not privileged to discuss that.
He's under strict
That's a really
NDAs.
good question, Myra, and thank you for that. And well, okay, so that brings up an interesting topic of satisfaction in the business.
Mm,
Sometimes, as a development artist, you may never see your work on screen.
mhm,
You are what you have to learn to do, which it took me a long time to learn, but you have to see yourself as part of a collaboration, and it's not about you individually, like, oh, I'm going to do my art and they better use it, it's got to be on the screen, and how can they not choose what I'm doing. In the beginning I was all caught up in that, and the first movie I worked on, Rescuers Down Under, I was very lucky to have gotten that work onto the screen. Exactly my style, all of my choices. That's, and then from that point on, it was like, hey, nobody's using my stuff. They're very happy with it, and I get paid whether they use it or not. But um, it's not. You're not getting that satisfaction of really feeling like you've been an influence. And and I'll get to Hercules here really quickly. But I had done a ton of design work on Pocahontas, and they were saying, "Oh, wait till you see the movie. You are going to be so amazed how we're using your work, and oh, your designs have really influenced us." And so I'm like, great. And I went, and I'm sitting in the theater watching this movie, and there's absolutely nothing. And my stomach is just like tying up in knots, and I was feeling a little bit sick. And and I realized at that point on, I have to change what my expectations are and how I see myself. I have to see myself as a team member, And even if what I do doesn't end up on the screen, it helps the director decide on what he does want, and that's important too. Showing them what they don't want helps them figure out what they do want. So on Hercules, it was just one of those so totally happy experiences where right from the start they just loved what I was doing, and they felt like I had the style that was just right for that movie. And so I just had the most wonderful time having my work accepted and then having to follow through. Once production began, I had to work with the layout people to help them understand what my style was about, and translate my style into a understanding so that a dozen other artists could do it, and figure out how to do what I do. And if anybody has ever been in that experience of having to draw like somebody else,
Yeah.
it is not easy. And I've been in that experience. I I've been asked to do a style that somebody else has done, and no matter how good you are or how good you think you are, sometimes you can't uh, get out of your default way of understanding shapes and language and design. You just can't make that transition to work like somebody else. It's brutal. So those poor guys had to figure out how to draw like me, and I don't envy it because it was a very eccentric design style on Hercules. But it was such a happy experience, and I appreciate the fact that that people like that movie.
How was it then to explain to somebody else how to draw like you? Because you don't think about how you draw, right? I mean, it's just how you draw, but you don't. It's like if you're going to draw like Jack Kirby, you go, okay, I know what Jack Kirby looks like. You know, you can kind of do an imitation, but it's almost like you're teaching somebody to do an imitation of you.
By the way, I did want to draw like Jack Kirby. I spent a good portion of my childhood trying to draw like Jack Kirby, and I don't think there's a soul on this planet who ever figured it out without just outright stealing them. But for Hercules, I did have to create sort of like a style book and break down shapes and explain them, and sort of make a Bible for people that they could look through and go, I do this because of that, and individual micro shapes versus major compositional shapes. Really had to try to break that down and analyze what you tend to do instinctively. It's hard to become objective about what you unconsciously do, and then
Right. Yeah.
make it understandable to somebody else.
Because a
And
lot of times it's a sort of a feeling, right? It's like this feels better than that. It's not like, oh, just add more pepper or add more garlic, or you know what I mean? It's like you look at something and go, I don't feel that this is looking the way I want. And then you have to sort of fight to get it. And that feeds into the fact that in animation, it's a team sport and everybody's got to draw the background. So it looks like one person drew
yeah,
it.
it's very hard. I mean, they do that. Disney would have to do that on every production. They would, like, imagine 101 Dalmatians having to draw that 60s style, that line work kind of.
That stuff is beautiful. That stuff is just amazing.
Yeah. Oh. But imagine being a traditional artist and then having to figure out how to draw like that. So yeah, I pity the fool that has to draw like me. I don't wish that on my worst enemy.
Did you learn something about your own work though doing that, having to explain to somebody else how to do you?
Well, okay, so I think I was starting to touch on this earlier, and then I just went somewhere else. But more recently, I started doing production, being a production designer on movies, and like 3 years ago, I was designing a movie that was made in China, and I set the style for it And actually, I worked like over a year on this movie. This was like the return of Happy Days.
Yeah.
Like, wow, I never thought I'd get to do this again, and I got to do it. But uh, there, I had to translate literally. It had to be translated from English to Chinese. But I had to train Chinese artists how to draw like me, and I had an evening Zoom call with a team of artists, and they had assignments, and I would review their work every evening and go over it and make corrections and explain. But you know what was funny about that? So much of it ended up being less about my particular style and more about just basic good drawing and design sense and composition. It was almost like yeah, you can end up drawing like me, and I can explain that, but without those fundamentals underneath it, it doesn't matter whether you can draw like me if your composition stinks,
Mm-hmm.
or if you know. One of the first things you probably learned when you were learning how to draw that I learned from books and two terms: ambiguous alignments and um, uh, ambiguous alignments and some tenuous contact and ambiguous alignment. Those are like the Bible terms of never, you must understand these two concepts and never repeat them. So like if I'm drawing a person sitting there, but there's something in the background touching my shape, that's a tenuous contact.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if something is behind me in a mirror, kind of similar shape to my head, that's an ambiguous alignment that duplicates. So, all those sort of fundamental things are things that I had to break down and explain over and over again, let alone teaching young Chinese artists how to draw like me. So,
Now, an interesting thing I just thought of in that, Bruce, is I think that for a young artist to hear something like that who has stars twinkling in their eyes, that sounds like a really great ego play. Yeah, I get to tell these people to draw it like me.
yeah,
But what we're talking about has nothing to do with ego, it's about the job.
yeah,
Right, and you being the key guy, you have to get this over to your team. This is how this stuff is supposed to look. It's not, like you said, it's not about you.
right. Yeah, and especially I think I had so much work to do on this movie without doing this teaching assignment thing. And when they told me, okay, now we brought on these young artists, and they need you need to train them. I went, oh, I just felt like I didn't have the time to do it. I didn't feel confident I could do it. It was more of a challenge than. I mean, I got to really like these young artists, and I enjoyed the time I spent with them. But it was it felt like a burden
Mm,
really to have to take a 2 hour part of my day and spend it doing this rather than trying to catch up with all the work they wanted me to do as
right.
well. So
And I
yeah,
imagine there was also a big time difference.
yeah. At dinner time, I was having a meeting, and then they would take my notes and make corrections, and then at 9 in the evening, we'd have a follow up where they would show me then what they just did for the last 2 or 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, not convenient.
That's a lot. I have a couple of things from the room. Our good buddy Eternity Forever, you have to say it like that,
Mhm.
says, Bruce, does learning shape language help in trying to copy another artist's style?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, every artist has their shtick, their thing. I once had to work on a project based on Gay and Wilson,
Mm-hmm.
and I had to draw backgrounds like Gay and Wilson, and so I studied his work a lot, and he had that kind of wobbly,
Yeah.
kind of ambiguous alignments everywhere, kind of thing. And it was about shape, I think, especially. So that was a shape language thing. But it gets into it'd be a question I would have to think a lot about, because so many artists have their peculiar thing, and it's maybe more subtle. Like some artists, exaggerate and successfully exaggerate,
Mhm.
and other artists are more traditional in how they stick closer to realism, and and each artist is different. So each artist is a challenge to figure out what it is they're doing, whether it be shape language or something else. Each artist is unique in the challenge of how you would try to draw like them. So
Mhm.
I can't imagine an overall easy way of explaining that.
And thanks, Eternity. That's a great question. Mike and I have some mutual friends who, a couple of people who are exclusive um, license license artists.
Mhm.
Like they do license work. If you need somebody to bang out a strawberry shortcake book, you call my guy. You know what I mean? And something like that would give me shingles. Like I couldn't do that if you put a gun to my head.
Yeah.
So, like, I don't know. Have you run into people like that in your career, of just like somebody who shows up at the studio and they just can't do it?
All the time. There's been projects where I just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I just failed miserably. Or I mean, you also too, when you're given an assignment, sometimes you think you understand the assignment and you do it, and then you look back and go,
Yeah.
well, I don't know where my head was at all on that one. I just totally missed it. But
Yeah.
I mean, it sometimes can be fun to draw like somebody else because you learn from it. I mean, you
Mm,
like if you're working from a great, like if you want to learn from Milt Kniff. I'm using a lot of really contemporary references.
Right. Yeah.
this is pencil to pencil. We do this every week, so everybody's up to.
Oh, good.
You're a good crowd. Yeah.
There's a thing that Milt Kniff does with his black and white and his more expressionistic way of handling forms versus like Wally Wood. Really, he figured out every little wrinkle and detail and nut and rivet and bolt. It was precisely understood by him, whereas Milt Kniff just broadly interpreted it in an almost abstract expressionistic way. And um, and in finding out what makes an artist tick, you can add that to your repertoire for sure. I think, I spent so many years trying to draw like Jack Kirby. I mean, to my, maybe on my dying deathbed day, in my last breath I take, I might have finally gone, I get it. I understand what Jack Kirby's doing, but up until then, right now, I've spent a lifetime looking at his work,
Mhm.
and I can sort of break it down and analyze it, but I could never do what he does, and but yet I have taken things from that have affected all the work that I've ever done in film design or comic books. There are pieces of Jack Kirby that are always being expressed in whatever I do.
Yeah, he was great. He was great with shape, rhythm, the little shapes within the big shapes. Things like that. Which you
Yeah,
see the older he got, the more you saw that expressed in his work, as opposed to the '60s stuff, which is still probably my favorite stuff, the Fantastic Four. But when he
yeah,
went to DC, the paper size changed, but he
yeah,
still drew this. He still drew the same size.
Mhm.
yeah,
He
right.
didn't reduce You know what I mean? And you can tell that the work that he did later was affected by the fact he wasn't drawing on those big, giant, twice-up pages anymore.
Oh boy, I'm so glad I didn't have. I mean, I did start when I worked for Marvel. I did work on Marvel paper, but when I started working for other companies, I could use my own paper in any size I wanted to, and boom, I went up big again. I just, my hand just like, working in the 11 by 17 piece of paper, trying to draw in one panel of 6 panels, all the little, oh, it's just a miserable experience. So it gives me the shudders to think about having to draw small.
So, Bruce, this might be a great place to transition into your comic book work. So,
Okay.
because you touched on that a little earlier about kind of juggling animation gigs with doing comics. How did you land inside of comics? And
Well,
maybe talk a little bit about that.
yeah, I got that first gig with Dark Horse Comics,
Yeah.
and then I was doing a lot of sample work, and then I got hired by this company TSR. It was a gaming company.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's all me right there. Yeah.
Oh
Uh-huh.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And they had a series of comic books based on their games, and I worked on Intruder. I was hired to come on, and I was really dying to get into comics, and I really got some chops going on that. Steve Grant was writing the stories, and I had so much fun on that. Although the curse in comics is when somebody else is inking your work. Oh God, the angst, the depression, the horror of seeing your work inked by I don't want to name any names, but to see your work ruined when it could have been so good, or even though, I mean, you think at the time it's good, looking back maybe it wasn't that good, but it still gets ruined by insensitive inkers, and so anyway, and then I was sending samples around to all the comic companies, and Caliber Press responded favorably, and I pitched a story idea to them I always wanted to do called The Zone Continuum. And so tell me you've read it.
Yeah.
No? Yes? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I got to do my first original creator on self-written, self-illustrated book with Caliber. And of course, they were a teeny company, and it was more a labor of love than anything financially favorable. But it opened the doors for me to really feel my oats in a comic book form. The thing that was always hard with comic books is the size. I mean, I had a problem of making everything too big in every panel and never leaving enough room for the word balloons. And then if I did leave enough room for the word balloons, I left just enough room for the word balloons. There wasn't a sense of negative space, and my panels were always way too crowded. My pages looked way too deep, too ornate, but I was doing it and learning slowly, very, very, very slowly. To this day, I have to still keep remembering that there's word balloons, and a negative space is important on a page and in a panel. Less is more, really, in a lot of ways. So and then so I had some better work that I was sending to Marvel and DC, and then Jim Salicrup was over at Marvel, and he hired me to do the Pirates of Darkwater series.
All right. Yeah.
So that got my foot in the door at Marvel.
Wow. And was this a period of time where how were all of your contacts and contacting people was just through mail drops, or you weren't going to conventions or kind of connecting with people at bars or anything like that?
Mailing in my samples. When I did that Silver Surfer store I told you about. I went some friends. We went to New York City. We went to Marvel headquarters uh, around the time. It would have been maybe 70. When would it have been? 76, 77. We went to
Wow.
Marvel.
Okay.
I wanted to meet Stan Lee and talk to him about my artwork.
Mm.
And so we went in there and we just walked right in the door of Marvel Comics. And then, they say, well, I'm sorry, but Stan's not in right now. If you want to leave something, we'll have Stan or whatever. The Stan was there, but they were. So we waited outside in the hallway for hours because they said Stan would be coming back soon. And we waited right in front of the elevator door. We sat on the floor. We were a bunch of hippies. And every time the elevator door would open, I would think, oh, Stan's going to walk out. This is going to be my moment. And we waited for hours through countless openings of that elevator door and never got to meet Stanley. So.
I have this vision of a knotted bed sheet dropping it from a window behind you.
Are they still there? Because
I gotta go to the bathroom.
That's right.
Meanwhile, all the other people like John Buscema maybe went by, or Ditko or Romita. See, you didn't care about them. You just wanted Stan.
So it's almost like we talked a little bit about this before we went on air about, and Mike brought up a really good point that it seems like a lot of animators want to do comics, and a lot of comics artists want to get into animation. Yeah. So I guess maybe you're proof positive of that.
There's one very interesting relationship between the two. When you work in animation, you get very well paid, but nobody ever sees your work. And sort of like at the end of the first Indiana Jones, your work is boxed up and it's taken down the hallway of infinity in Warehouse 51 to be stuck in some cabinet somewhere forever.
That's right.
And maybe when you worked on the production, maybe 8 or 10 people saw your work, and then it's gone forever, except if you made copies. So you don't, even if your work ends up sort of on screen, it all goes by so fast. Nobody's really looking at it and going, wow, that's so. You sort of want to do comics because that's 100% you on that page. That's your work for everybody to see, and it's there to be held and poured over. Hopefully, I mean, if somebody likes it.
Right.
But then the other side is that the pay really sucks.
Yeah.
You'll do comics for a while, and then you'll just go, "Oh my God, I gotta get back into animation again, and I gotta get ahead on my bills." And so there's this relationship between the two. They each provide something, but neither. I never was like a super successful artist in comics to the point where it became a really sustaining career.
Mm-hmm. No, I saw that. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just going to say the other thing is that I know from having worked in animation for a while, and other people, they come in, and that thing that you talked about where like you work on a bunch of designs, and then they go, no, this we're scrapping this whole thing, and we're starting over again. And then you got to sort of like motivate yourself to go back in and get fired up to create something, because like you said, you're not getting the reward of like that's going to be unless you're actually painting the physical background. Right. You see it on the screen. I know that doesn't work for everybody. There doesn't work for there's a lot of very talented people that wouldn't work for them to be able to have their work shoved in a box or have to go. Have you had that experience of working on a production where you had to like they scrapped it and then you have to start over fresh again?
Well, it's sort of that happens all the time, really. I I I think I often look at myself as a tie salesman on production, where the director or the art director, they really have no idea what they want, and that's often the case. That
Mhm.
they're just looking for you to give them something that's gonna, light a light bulb over their head.
Mhm.
And and most of the time it doesn't. I mean, most of the time they go, well, that's really nice, but give me something else, and then you give them something else. So you're sort of like somebody, you're the tie salesman, and somebody comes in and you go, oh, would you like the stripes? I've got stripes. No, well, what about the polka dots? You like polka? Hey, well, I got plaid, and you just keep showing them ties until maybe one. I was on the Criterion edition of the Iron Giant, and I was working on a scene that Brad Bird wanted. There's an additional couple minutes of animation in the Criterion version, and it was an alien civilization, and it was going to be on screen for probably 2 seconds, and then it gets blown up.
Mhm.
So it's going to be 1,000, 1,000, and that's it for this alien city on a landscape. And I did so many versions of it. And then at first, Brad would go, "Oh, I really like that. Let's see some more along that line." And then Brad would have seen something else, and he goes, "Well, I said, what about? Can you think of something like this or that?" So I was a glorified tie salesman, and I finally I think I got him something he liked, but it was just and all the time I knew it wasn't going to be seen for nobody would it would be in somebody's subconscious that they had seen that once in a fleeting moment, but it would never be in anybody's conscious mind. And so
Mhm.
that's really hard. And then you get to the point where you exhaust yourself of ideas. Like I've done 30 versions of an alien city. What else can I think of? and you come to your drawing board in the morning and you just go, what do I got? Nothing. And then
Yeah.
where and then I used to do things like, oh, I'd look in the waste paper basket and there'd be a crumpled up piece of paper, and I'd take the paper up and put it on my desk and go, oh, a crumpled piece of paper, well, there's an idea for architecture. Or I have a half-eaten apple. Oh, I could make buildings that look like half-eaten apples or something. So,
Wow. Yeah, you're like feeling around in the dark.
yeah,
Right. Or like, I'll draw this with my left hand and see what
yeah,
happens.
that'd be a good idea.
And I just feel like, what one of my roles on the show is to kind of give the question from a layman perspective or the fans perspective, like, wow, this must be exciting, Bruce, to work in this industry. Wow, my childhood, things like that. But there has to be, maybe we could talk about this, the limit of mental, I don't know, exhaustion, kind of what you were talking about. Like, have you been in places where there's been some people who just couldn't handle the workload and just had to ring the bell, and they got kind of washed out? Does that happen?
Well, I've always thought that was ultimately going to be all of our future, whether
Right.
we get there sooner or later. You get to the point where you got nothing, and how
Right.
do you prolong that uh, as long as you can? Like, how do you keep yourself stimulated? Like, we
Hmm.
certainly, create our studios as a nurturing womb
Yeah.
uh,
Mm.
that inspires us, and you have to, like even watching movies and looking at things that other artists are doing. You have to really work hard to keep yourself stimulated. But when it's under pressure in
Yeah.
production,
Right.
you know, it's you just don't know. It's not like I have the confidence every day when I sit down. "No, I can do this." I sit down in the morning and I don't know what the hell I'm going to do or if I can do it. And I always think waking up and going to sit down to work is sort of like going up the hill to the well, the top of the hill, and you're going to lower the bucket down and you hope there's water to bring up today
Mm-hmm.
because there might have been some water in that well yesterday, but there may not. The well may be dry today, and what do you do? And the funny thing too, you probably know, a day has a rhythm to it, and a week has a rhythm to it, creative wise.
Mm-hmm.
At least for me,
Mm-hmm.
it's like Monday is the worst because I've had a weekend off. I haven't been working that brain muscle for drawing
Mm-hmm.
and I look at what I did Friday and I went, who was that? That looks amazing. I don't know who that was because that's not me Monday morning.
Mm-hmm.
And then so now you're on Monday building up momentum, getting a head of steam going, doing whatever it takes, coffee or stimulants or inspiration or playing music or whatever. The day's rhythm kind of slowly builds, and then by the end of the day, it's pretty good, and you're being creative, and you end the day on a high note. And then Tuesday, it's kind of back up the hill, but it's a little bit better than Monday. Takes a little less time to get the momentum going until Friday comes, and it's like running on all 8 cylinders. It's like supercharged, and
And
you know,
it took you a week to get there.
yeah, but it's like you get into that alpha wave
Yeah.
finally, or like if you have a deadline and you're like in the last 3 hours of a deadline, you're like going so fast and you're drawing. You're not even consciously drawing anymore. You're unconsciously in alpha state,
Yeah.
and everything is wonderful. I mean,
Yeah.
it all opens up to you and then it's like, okay, I've mailed that off, and now tomorrow I've got a new assignment, and it's like, it's like, or sort of like when you had life drawing classes, and they go, okay, you've got 5 minutes to do a full figure drawing. And you go, okay, 5 minutes, and it's beautiful. And then they go, okay, now we will do a 2 hour pose. And then it's like, no, 2 hours, 2 hours. And it's like, oh, I'm so stiff and it looks so horrible. It's got none of the vitality of that 5 minute pose.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, do you get to, because everything's digital now, do you get to keep some of your artwork now as opposed to mailing it off into the crates?
Yeah. It's funny. It sort of happened that, well, okay, so there was a period of time where I was doing traditional artwork, and then I would send it to them through an upload process, and that's how I turned in my work. But then at the end of the production, they would still say, "Okay, mail us in everything.
Oh wow.
We
Okay.
own it. It's ours. We made you. It's our artwork." And so, uh, and then there was a period that came about where they just felt like, just send it to us digitally, and that's fine. And then, yeah, I can keep my artwork. This is great. But then there was a point where, as I started working more in the digital process and less in traditional medium, that the work itself is digital. I mean, maybe I would do half of it in traditional pencil, scan it in, finish it on my graphic tablet. And so at that point that you're at, from that point on, there really is no original artwork that you get to keep. It's just,
Right. Yeah.
it's all digital work that is totally owned and by the studio, and you have nothing of your own of it, really.
So what's your setup like? What are you What are you drawing in, and what are you drawing with?
Well, I've got a really beautiful old draftsman's table, and I like to just start off in a sketch. If we're talking about film, I'll do a lot of noodling, detail, sketching, thumbnailing, because I've realized that uh, everything happens when it's small, and if I try to thumbnail or if I try to rough big, I'm I can't get far enough away from it to see the whole composition in its most pure, simple, small form. So I always try to work real small and solve all my compositional problems, and then I translate that into a bigger drawing. But rather than I will scan that little drawing and blow it up so it's that exact same little, because everything in that little thing is just right.
Yeah.
And if I try to just set that thing over to the side and go, okay, now I'll do a big drawing of it, it's like I'm trying to copy that eye to eye,
Mhm.
and I'm just not getting the dynamics of it or the proportions right.
Right.
So I stopped doing that a long time ago. I just went, screw it. I'm scanning it, I'm blowing it up, and I'm putting it on a light box. I'm retracing it onto a piece of paper, and I'm not going to mess around with trying to duplicate it by hand.
Right.
So then I'll just do maybe, a part of a day of working out the line work detail of it, and then boom, it goes into the scanner, and then it goes into Photoshop, and then I work on my Cintiq
Mhm.
graphics tablet to
Did
finish
you
it.
create your own brushes, or do you use a brush pack, or?
No, I try to keep the whole damn digital process as simple as possible. I even hate working on layers. It's like
Mhm.
I don't know how people do it because I've watched a lot of tutorials, and I mean I think because we grew up training our brain to work a certain way, maybe I'm just not able to make the transition. But if I have to think about masks and 20 different brush patterns,
Mhm.
and I've got 30 layers, and give me a break. I don't have the brain for it.
Yeah.
If I had started off young learning that way, I honestly don't know how people keep track of layers.
It seems like there's a lot that gets in the way of you actually doing it when you're having all those layers. And I know that I know people that do it, and sometimes the thing has like 200 layers
Yeah,
on something, like how do you remember that? And then you got to put them in folders, and it's like there's so much between you. That's what I was talking about in the beginning. Just the joy of you just
yeah,
taking a pencil and drawing on a sheet of paper is so pure. But then you have to try to replicate your pure process
right.
through this
Mhm.
layer of digital stuff. And like I said, I think you're right. I think if you started when you were 15 on a iPad,
Yeah,
because for me, a lot of it is just the feedback that I get from my hand and the pencil on the paper never feels like the Cintiq. It
Right.
all feels the same.
right.
So part of me when I'm drawing, I don't know if it's the same for you, but it's almost there's like a almost like a sculptural process of how you feel. You're drawing these big shapes and you're relating one shape to the other and you're going back. It's very organic. And like you said, sometimes you don't even think about it. You're feeling it.
Mhm.
Right.
But the digital thing, which is great, you can do a lot of great stuff with it. But I never have that same feeling. It always feels plastic
Right. Well,
because that's what I'm drawing on.
my goal in working digitally is to keep it as intuitive as possible. So I just maybe use three different brushes, maybe, or every now and then I'll pull out a special effects brush or something. But I just try to work on, like if I have my original drawing scanned in, I put it on multiply, and then I have the layer underneath it where I put the color, and that's the only layer I want to deal with unless I
Yeah.
under certain circumstances, I'll have other layers like for special effects, but I just try to keep it to a minimum, and I just want to work. I just want the fluid, intuitive flow of feeling like I'm painting. And,
Yeah, I have one for you. You ready for this? Layer three, copy, layer three, copy, X64, layer, copy, layer.
And then inevitably you draw on the wrong damn layer. Like,
oh, and then I have to combine those two layers together. And
Yeah.
I don't want to think about which layer do I need to go to make this next color. That's
But you know, it's funny. There are a lot, like our buddy Tim's like, maybe layers. But there are a lot of people there who just like are cringing at us having this conversation about what do you mean you don't work in layer? Like it's like the reverse agita of putting everything in one line on one layer. And I agree with you, Bruce. I'm kind of the same way. Like if I have more than 3 layers, it must be really important or special. Is it's just like boom, 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 and that's all I want to deal with. Yeah.
Yeah, if there's like some sun rays coming in or some dappling or a sunburst or something. But I watch the tutorials of other artists painting, and they're just, my God. I mean, they don't even really know what they're doing when they start, and I mean they do beautiful work. So I mean it works for them, but you know they're constantly doing something, then they move it around, and then they repair it, and then they flip it, and then they transform, and then they add something. You know, it's just like they're searching, they're hunting for varieties of shapes, and then they do all this work, but then let's change the colors, and I mean they're constantly manipulating, and
Right.
and for me, I want to figure it out in it before I start the process. I want to solve my problems before I begin the artwork. But you know, you want to allow for some discovery and
right.
freshness to it. It's sort of like when you're inking your artwork in comics. I mean, if inking is only a mechanical duplicating of your pencil work, it can make inking really a painful process of tedium. Whereas if the pencils are a little looser and you're fleshing out some of the detailing in the inking, you're finishing. You're actually, the inking is more about creating the artwork than it is copying your pencils. So there's ways you have to work, I think, to keep your process intuitive. So it's still fresh and enjoyable. I mean, that's really, man, that's the goal.
Bruce, I have a question for you, and then we're going to start wrapping it up. You've been a fantastic
Oh,
guest.
thank you.
I hope you don't have to like you're holding in a pee or something like that. This is always it's
I
always.
think I'm supposed to make dinner tonight, so I could be in trouble.
Uh-oh.
And my dog just was barking again. He wants me to feed him. So.
Yeah, the dog is trying to give you a warning, like it's time to wrap this up. I almost forgot what I was going to say. I was going to ask you, how has the pandemic affected your studio practice?
Nothing. Well,
Yeah.
okay, so there was work that I think slowed down because of the pandemic. Productions halted, and that was a deal. But as far as I was still working through the pandemic. I got a job last year that came to me off of LinkedIn. I became a production designer on a film in Vietnam.
Wow.
So why don't you explain a little bit what a production designer does as opposed to what a background designer does?
Well, okay, there are many types of production designers.
Right.
And I'm the kind of production designer, sounds like a song. And I don't care, chop little day. So I'm not a high-tech production designer like a lot of production designers. I mean, they create the look of the project, style-wise, design-wise, but then they also get into the weeds on creating 3D modeling of things, and like, okay, here's this environment, and you can rotate it and look at it from different angles, and They're spelling out all the details for the production crew. And so I'm not that type of person. I'm still a traditional production designer who may set a look or style for the whole movie that even transfers into maybe how the characters are done a little bit, but
Mhm.
also how the props are done, how the lighting, the staging, the compositions, um, the shape language, everything can come from the production designer. And um, and sometimes, I mean, an art director can sort of overlap into that too. Although the art director really gets into the weeds on every nook and cranny of how the production has to mechanically be assembled. So I'm more of a designer type production designer, but not a technician
Yeah.
production designer.
Hmm. Um, Mike, we're going to ask him another
I was
question.
just going to say, so that would be different than when you're designing a production for animation, where you're sort of setting the design, but you're being actually pretty specific because what you're doing is actually going to show up. It's not going to be interpreted by other people necessarily. I mean, other people will be drawing the backgrounds, but
Yeah. Well,
um,
okay, yeah. So on some movies, a production designer, like what I did on Hercules, was almost like a production designer. Just sort of like Ivan Earl, I guess, was a production designer on Sleeping Beauty,
right.
but he didn't do everything. He people had to figure out how to do it like him, and then they had to handle other areas without him. But this movie I worked on in China, um, I ended up literally designing every single place the story went to and almost all the props. I mean, it was over a year of like roughly does laying out every single scene that every time it changed from this place to that place, or even from this angle to that angle, reverse angle. Well, what are we seeing now on the other 180 degrees of the set? Um, I touched everything on that movie, and so I spelled it all out. I've never done that before, and
Mhm.
I don't. It was crazy that I was doing that.
Well, I guess that must be pretty rewarding to try something like that because it's very deep to be that involved in the production.
I haven't seen the movie yet, so
Oh, okay.
I have no hopes.
Have you seen
I know
stills? I mean,
I do have. I mean, honestly, it was the most fun I've ever maybe had on a movie, and I worked with two of the most talented two of the most talented directors, Ralph and Dick Zondag, uh, who are just such wonderful people, and they just embraced what I was doing, and it was thrilling to just have that kind of relationship on a production.
Um, a couple last questions, so we can let you out the door gracefully. Um, what is your social media presence like, and do you enjoy
Hmm.
kind of posting online? Does that detract from your regular studio practice? Like, you have to stop what you're doing to put some things on Instagram, or have you kind of how does that work for you?
No, I really like social media. I took it seriously for a while and really wanted to um, build a following, I guess,
Hmm.
big following. Because you look at guys that've got 10,000 people on Twitter or
Yeah,
whatever or Instagram, and I'm
yeah.
going, holy shit, how do they? So there was a time when I really tried to dive full into it, and I just couldn't do it. It was so demanding. I mean, I tried to get on Reddit,
Hmm.
and they felt like, oh, you're a spammer. You're just promoting yourself. You're not part of the community
Yeah.
because I'm not like. And so I think to really be accepted in a community like even Facebook, you have to see what other people are doing. You have to have relationships with them, and make comments on what they're doing, and not just have it be a one-way street. And that's terribly time consuming. I try to do that on Facebook because I like so many people there, and I Facebook is really stimulating for me artistically.
It's also more our, I talk about this all the time with some younger friends of mine. It's also our peer group is on Facebook.
Yeah.
They have started going over to Twitter and Instagram,
Mhm.
but all the people who would hire me are on Facebook.
Yeah, Facebook or LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've got a lot of the younger people that are on Instagram and Twitter, but the churn on Instagram is so crazy now. You really have to try to, and now they've changed the whole thing because they want to be like TikTok. So you just posting your art and it's sort of like you have to like. What I found out was there are some things I post to Twitter, some things I post to Instagram, some things I post to Facebook. There's things that I post on Twitter nobody will give a shit about.
Right.
I post that same thing on Instagram and I'll get hundreds of people will like it.
Yeah, go figure.
Mhm.
Yeah, I got 60,000 views on
Wow.
LinkedIn with one piece of artwork that I did, but maybe on Facebook, 122,
Yeah.
likes or or likes.
It's just Jeffrey Katzenberg liking it over and over and over and over.
But no, you need to almost have some technical expertise too about how do you handle your hashtags and
Yeah.
you know, embedding things. It's really almost a full-time job, and I tried and I just couldn't do it. And
It is hard. You're right because you realize that all the people that are directors, producers, stars, musicians, they all have a staff, and that's what they do. They manage their social media. They know, okay, we do this on TikTok, we do
yeah,
this over here,
at
and if
this
you're,
yeah, like
yeah,
do Twitter at this time, and then also how you do it. I mean, it's not enough just to show this is my new picture I did. Uh, it's sort of like you have to brand yourself almost as a personality, and you have to have a style and a special thing about you that makes you kind of fun and hip and witty or interesting.
So what would be a couple pieces of advice you would give? Because now everybody wants to be a concept designer. Everybody wants to be a character designer. Which is what Disney invented in like what 1930. They invented character design and concept. I mean, they were the guys that perfected it.
Yeah.
That whole idea. What would you advise?
Run away.
You heard it here, folks. You heard it here.
Oh, I run. Oh, run. That's the end of Camelot.
Right. Yeah.
No, run.
Because we get a lot of youngsters as well, or people who are like thinking of transitioning, from.
I first have to say, follow your passion. If you love it, do it. Don't let me or anybody else talk you out of it. But don't quit your day job. Have a reliable skill, a useful skill that can earn you income, and then you will be able to survive in the competition that's out there. And when we were all starting off in this thing, I mean, there were just dozens of concept artists, and a concept artist could be in demand, and then they started all these concept art schools and tutorials and classes, and you do a 1 year course and graduate, and you're amazing. I mean, because you're doing things digitally, you don't have to learn so much of the traditional foundation of drawing skills. You can kind of dive into Photoshop and Illustrator, and in a year you can become a wizard. I mean, and these schools are just churning graduates out by the thousands a year, and everybody wants to get into that business. And it just be aware of the competition that's out there. Now, having and also look at it and see the sameness about it.
Mm-hmm.
Most people are working with a similar color palette. They're sort of using similar stolen kind of realistic shapes, and they're what are they, photo bashing kind of
Yeah.
thing. Even though it may be hand painted, it's still a form of photo bashing. Or it's there's just a normalcy about what it is that you're looking at. And 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 to come full circle back to Jack Kirby, I mean, the one thing I always kept from studying him is that everything he seems to do to me has a unique idea behind it. If it was a machine or a gadget or a city, there's a concept at work there. There's an idea that he's presenting to you about it that's telling a story. And so that's why I try to think of when I'm doing this is what is the story of what this set is or this object is, that it's not just a building, it's a building that has a personality, or it's a shape that is expressing something. And I think that's what I don't see as much in all the similarities of concept art, is that it's a landscape, it's a city street, it's an alien civilization, but I'm not seeing something I haven't seen before.
It's a castle in the background, the little guy in the foreground,
Yeah.
silhouetted kind of thing. Yeah.
So if you are intent on being a concept artist, look at what other people are doing and try to make yourself unique. Try to have a style that's fresh and different, a palette that's exciting, and there's always studios that will want something new and exciting, and you can never discourage somebody from going the route, investing the time, and getting their work out there to directors and producers and people, and the hopes of breaking in. I mean, but just be aware of the competition and have a job you can support yourself with while you're doing it, so you won't give up after a year or two. If you're on the edge and you're living in a one-room apartment, you can't pay the rent, and at some point you're going to break if you're only relying on income from your artwork, but you could go for 5 years, 10 years supporting yourself and improving and reaching out and get discovered, because you could survive that long in the business. So
Very cool. All right, we're gonna put a pin in this. Bruce, you've been amazing to talk
thanks
to.
very much.
Thank you.
Awesome.
It was a great pleasure talking to you, and thank you for all those questions, because it's like somebody out there likes me.
They really like.
They really like you.
I have a closing statement from our buddy J. Robert Deans. Mr. Zick, with all respect to your career in total, I have to bring up Plastic Man and Thundar the Barbarian.
Oh yeah,
shows I loved in my younger days.
Awesome.
Thank you for your contributions.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Bruce, if you don't mind, you want to hang around on our way out? We have a little thing we do. I think you'll enjoy it.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh yeah, thank you guys for checking us out. We'll be back here again next Wednesday at 8 p.m. EST with another fascinating guest, or maybe we'll do a boot camp. Who knows? The world is our oyster, Mike Manley. I don't know if you knew that.
That's true.
That is very true. But thank you guys so much. If you're new to the channel, please stick around or go back into the past and look at our many videos with
look at the variants of our podcast past.
The Delta variant of our other interviews. So you guys have a great night. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And you know what to do on your way out the door, you guys. Don't forget to wash those curvy hands. Go, Bruce, put them up. Put those curvy hands up. There you go.
There we go.
Nice. All right. Have a good night, guys.